Hello. Very last level of our course, our very condensed and short course of behavioral economics, giving you tips that will be helpful in our live classes in order to project the video game together. So, indeed, I decided to put at the very end one of the most important elements that we need to deal with when thinking about behavioral economics, and most importantly, to experiments, because experiments are the methodology that makes economics behavioral. So I think that this is what makes behavioral economics, the use of experiments. And of course, experiments are delicate. So I would like to convey this message. Once we talk seriously, which means evidence-based with science and scientific results about behavioral economics, we need to deal with methodology, rigor of methodology, and the fact that experiments are delicate. Everything is delicate. So, because indeed there is a sort of very cheap narrative about behavioral economics, nudges, that is sort of sexy in terms of the public discourse, but not very helpful to address real problems. So everything has to be treated seriously and in the way in which science is made. So most of the time, results are not sexy, are not catchy at all, but the methodology assures the robustness of what you talk about. So this is the very important message that I would like to stress at the very end of our course. Which means that as long as we talk about experiments run with people, because typically experiments in hard sciences are run using cells, not scalar magnitudes, which means that if you run an experiment in biology, you work with cells. If you run an experiment in epidemiology, you run an experiment with scalar magnitudes. While human beings are not scalar magnitudes, are actually living creatures interacting with the environment, which means that you need to take care most of all about the rigor of the methodology. And so there are some rules that we need together we go through quickly in order to understand how important it is to use this methodology in research. First of all, informed consent, which means that research, all the time you run an experiment, you need to receive consent from all the participants before the experiment is carried out. Once you recruit students in a lab, you actually need to have their informed consent. This is a very important element, and gives me the possibility of discussing a very famous experiment of a few years ago, run through the use of a artificial lab like Facebook is. I mean, any social platform is a lab because there is many data point and people interacting with lots of information there. So a very elegant experiment has been run using Facebook a few years ago, wanting to test the existence of social contagion. What is social contagion? I mean, the question of the research was, does the fact of being exposed to particular messages in Facebook changes the mood of people active on Facebook? And the experiment has been run like a rigorous experiment, exploiting the information availability on Facebook. So the population of users as a subsample of the population of users, but indeed it has been 600,000 people for 2 weeks, has been randomly assigned to three different conditions. One actually is the control group, so nothing changes, but other two groups were exposed, one for 2 weeks to content in the news feed containing mostly positive language and positive message and positive images, while the second group has been exposed to languages, messages, posts containing mostly negative messages. And not surprisingly, after 2 weeks, I mean, the people in the two treatment groups changed their mood. So people exposed to positive message started sharing more positive message, and people exposed to negative messages started posting more negative messages. Social contagion is there. But what's the point with informed consent? Actually, the paper has been published in a very important scientific review, the Proceeding of Natural Academy of Sciences, PNAS, but a big discourse has started about the ethics behind this experiment. Does Facebook inform its users about the possibility of that user to be exposed to an experiment like that? And indeed, I mean, if you go through the paper, you will see that the editorial board added on a preface about the important issue arise by this fact. So you need to inform your subjects about what you are doing. This is very important. Second, important as well, debriefing. Once you run an experiment, participants should be made aware of the purpose of the experiment and have any answers or concerns resolved. We have seen in a few of the videos that we share what I'm mentioning here. I mean, basically, you need to inform through email, to written messages, but also through a meeting, your participants of what is and what was the aim and the purpose of the experiment, and answer all the questions and doubts that can come from that audience. Then, protection of participants. Throughout the experiment, participants have to be kept safe from any sort of distress, physical harm and mental harm. It may sound exaggerating, but it's not. I mean, I'm talking about experiment that actually artificially treat human beings as cells, and they are not. I mean, they're living creatures interacting with the environment with their freedom and responsibility. So it's very important to keep subject safe. And I mean, if you think about the particular kind of experiment that can be run with the children, that is so important. So you need to involve, and most of the time you need to involve a psychologist managing the treatment of your subjects. And I mean, the importance of safety and the importance of keeping people safe is one of the major elements of experiments. So other very interesting issue to be debated is deception, because in theory, then we see that the situation is fuzzier than it seems, but in theory, economic experiments are not supposed to willfully mislead participants or omit critical information. That is not allowed, although we have seen that it happens because there are actually overlapping experiments between psychology and economics. So psychology admits the possibility of manipulation, which means that manipulation may be the experiment with the matrix test, in which you don't let the participants know that the shredder is not a real shredder. But it may be also that you come to a lab and you face a computer screen in which you are said that on the other side of the screen there is another human being interacting with you, and there is not. Maybe it's just a computer answering to your moves. So this is actually what makes quite different psychology from economics. And another important issue is that in economic, you need to pay participants of an experiment. That is actually mandatory for experiment in economics, because it's considered a real incentive, particularly for students, to behave accordingly to rationality. Confidentiality, such an important issue, especially in very recent years. So participants' details for no reason have to be shared. They have to be kept anonymous. So that even the participation to an experiment is something that is protected by non-disclosure agreement between the experimenter and the participants. Finally, very important, withdrawal from the investigation. At any time, the participants has to be made able to leave the experiment with no consequences. So you may be recruited, you may manifest the will to join the experiment, but you need to have the freedom to exit, to opt out. And that is very important. So these are actually characteristics that let me introduce the concept of ethics, which is so important. And now we go a little bit into other issues that are important as well. Starting from the Clever Hans effect, which takes this name after a very famous case at the end of the 19th century in Germany, because there was a doctor who was basically sure that animals have a much higher level of intelligence than it is commonly known. So his will was to demonstrate through experiment that even animals are able to perform some cognitive tasks. For example, making simple arithmetic competition. And I mean, this doctor went on and on through Germany organizing tour with his horse Hans that was making a performance in which basically using his feet and bouncing up and down the feet was answering arithmetical question all the time correctly. But what's the point? That what the doctor associated to the principle of causation. So Hans is able to answer correctly to a mathematical question because he's able to perform abstract thinking, was demonstrated later to be just a fake cause, because indeed other experiments later showed that animals, differently than human beings, are able to perceive micro movement of our body, interpret our body language in a way that they behave accordingly to the interpretation of that body language, which means that even if it was unperceivable for human being, maybe just the movement of an eye of the doctor was giving the horse the idea that that was the moment of using the feet in order to say that is the answer to the question, which is not elaborating like in system 2 the answer to the mathematical question. So the clever Hans effect is associated to experimental economics to say that basically experiments are run in order to isolate cause and effect and avoid the problem of correlation. This is the reason why I insisted on the fact that focus groups not anymore are very relevant in getting information about the quality of a product, because you never have the control group there to isolate your hypothesis and make a reason argument about the existence of causation. Or it's much more delicate. I work with this data answering the question, how happy are you? Because there are many, I mean, you need to validate the questionnaire in order to solve some of the problems that are there in surveys. For example, typically when you treat data related to subjective well-being, people over-report their level of well-being. What does it mean? That on a scale 0-10, you clearly see the numbers between 6 and 10, but you are sort of ashamed, you fear social stigma if you answer 0, 1, and 2. But from the researcher's point of view, this is maybe the population you're more interested on. Or are you doing something to treat missing values? Because missing values in a service are not at all random most of the time. So this is the problem of selection bias. Are you sure that people not answering to a question are randomly distributed over the population, or that segment is actually particularly associated to some characteristics? I don't know. For example, in the questions related to subjective well-being, people not answering are actually the more unhappy people that really are depressed. And so leaving them out from the survey may be not the best way of dealing with the problem of subjective well-being. To give you a clear example of selection bias, this is a very famous story, more narrated. In reality, is much more complex, but in the substance, that's the truth. Maybe you went with Professor Manera through the courses of econometrics and quantitative methods in exploring the Wald test. Wald is the name of a statistician that became famous during the Second World War because he was hired as a consultant by US and British Army to understand something, because basically there were war airplanes, and looking at data, the army wanted to see what were the part of the airplane that needed to be reinforced. So what was the case? So this is a bullet-free airplane. I mean, once airplanes went through mission and came back, this was the situation. So these all are the all these are the airplanes coming back after a mission. And so you may ask, what are the parts that you are going to reinforce in order to make them more resistant? And I mean, typically, and this is the problem of selection bias, you may be tempted to say, well, I'm gonna to reinforce the part that have been hit by bullets. But Val said, not at all. I mean, the fact that the plane came back shows that the part hit are the more resistant, while the part in which you see the hole are basically the parts of the airplane that have not come back. So this is selection bias. You need to consider your population in order to be sure that you can find robust results that constitute an evidence, an empirical evidence for your research question. And this is basically the reason why randomized controlled trials exist and have been introduced as a robust methodology to assess the causal relationship between a dependent variable and independent variable. And this is very important from an ethical point of view, because all the time we talk about behavioral economics, we need to be sure that behind the result there is a randomized controlled trials that basically follows all the rules that we have described at the beginning. Otherwise, it's cheap behavioral tips. Sometimes I use them as well, but it's important to be aware of that. So, what is the problem with the experiment? I said during the previous videos that I was going to get back on that. So, actually, a few years ago, a big rumor has been spreading all around the scientific community, because on a report in Science, researchers were going to find out if once you publish a study based on an experiment, some other people try to replicate the results of that study. What's the problem? That for the structural way in which scientific publications do work, the peer review is a very, very rigorous mechanism, but indeed, surprising results catch more the attention of the editorial board and are more fancy also for the authors. So let's get back on something that we mentioned during the classes, the distance classes, the choice overload problem and the JAM experiments, which is actually kind of very rigorous experiment conducted by Iyengar and Lepper in 2000. But after a few years, there was a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis is the research through which you search all the existence empirical evidence on an issue and you find out if there is robustness in the evidence. And a meta-analysis conducted on the choice overload found mixed evidence. So sometimes choice overload happens, which means that less is more, less options go towards better choice and activation. But some others, and in some other contexts, that is not what happens. Indeed, actually, more options translate onto better choices. So the issue of reproducibility started what is called reproducibility crisis, because the point is, there is so far, due to the way in which experiments work, editorial boards or authors do not pay attention to results that are not sexy, and also to the replication of results, because if you just confirm something that already has been proven, that is not worth a publication. While actually more and more, and this is actually the result of a survey made on Nature, shows that that would be important. I mean, in order to guarantee the quality of your result and the quality of your experiment, it could be important to introduce also some incentives to publish just the reproduction of results that are considered as share in the literature. And I think that this has been, and is still going, a very important moment in behavioral sciences, because everybody now is taking more care on the quality of the setup of an experiment, following the rules that we started with at the beginning of this video. Other very important element to pay attention when thinking about an experiment: beware of unintended consequences. And I mean, this is something again related to what we discussed during the videos, because in the 90s of the last century in the US, the federal administration promoted a law that wanted to make public the salaries of the CEOs and the managers of the big corporations, with the idea that if you make public and transparent the salaries, actually companies will pay attention to the fact of more equality. But what's the point if the contrary of that happens? Because if you make transparent payment and some CEOs realize that they are underpaid with respect to other CEOs, they're gonna complain about that and their salary is gonna be raised, which some claim is what really happened after the introduction of this law. So remember when we were discussing the proposition of the gender gap in UK? Actually, this is one of the hypotheses you need to test. Maybe you have good intentions because you want to make transparent salaries and to make more equal the distribution of payments, but you obtain the opposite result. That was one of our issues when dealing with the experiment I was describing, run with my colleagues for Confartigianato. Will companies paying late be induced to pay before just because of the priming, or will basically adapt to what the other people are doing? That is an important hypothesis to test and to keep in mind. We discuss about the nudging ethics. It's called libertarian paternalism because basically you may be tempted to consider as like a controller, an external controller, someone that has in mind what is better for you. And basically, there is a paternalism all the time. Someone decides from social welfare perspective what is good for everybody. But indeed, libertarianism and freedom is important as well. So you need to be sure that people have a great easiness in changing your course of action. And randomized control trials are important, especially for that, because giving the results of a test, the let's say valorization of scientific research, is important to guarantee the quality of your experiments and the independent of your decisions with respect to your opinion. I mean, maybe you have an opinion, you have an hypothesis, but you test it. So it's a very important sentence that I learned from a journalist in UK, Tim Harford. Opinions are hypotheses to be tested, not treasures to be safeguarded. That's a very important insight. I'm gonna approach to the end. That is somehow related to ethics with respect to marketing. The fluency heuristics says that as very fast decision makers, the context is important in affecting our decision, and sometimes the way in which information is presented has an unintended impact on our decisions. So there is a famous study in which basically people in couples have been asked in two different groups to rate their level of love for the significant others, but in two different conditions. So one group needed to list the 3 reasons why you love your partner, while the other group was supposed to list down the 10 reasons why you love your significant others. And what's the point? And what's the fluency heuristics? The more easy it is to recall to your mind reasons why you love your significant other. So it's going to be pretty simple to find 3 reasons why you love your significant other. And the more likely it is that you self-evaluate your level of love higher with respect to person that find it difficult, because it's difficult. You need time to find 10 reasons why you love your significant others. And maybe you may deduce from that you don't like that much your significant other. And that was actually the result of this experiment. But what's the point with regards to marketing strategy? Companies know that in the fact that very simple name, very simple images, very simple logos attract our attention. And that's sometimes there are studies showing that these sort of companies outperform in terms of capital value others. It applies to Apple, Amazon, that connects ANZ. Very simple and very easy to recollect. So I'm really close to the end. and I'm inviting you, and I will organize a couple, 2 or 3 evening after dinner of a social game digital, in which we will play digitally a board game that is based on moral dilemmas. Cioè, we will play together, and this is just a way of discussing very important moral issues that I think are so important in our everyday life. The trolley problem is famous because this is the typical situation. I mean, you imagine that there is a trolley going on a track and then there is a bifurcation, and if you go right, there will be and I mean, this is actually what if you do nothing, you go right and there is like 5 person on the track lying. If you go left, but you need to activate the lever here, you will kill just 1 person because it's there. So the question is, do you do something? Because typically you are the girl or the guy here needing to activate the lever. What do you do? I mean, are you going to kill 1 person and save 5, or do nothing and therefore 5 person are gonna die and you do not kill the person? I mean, this is a moral dilemma, and we can play it in many different contexts. And that's the idea of this board game that I'm gonna organize digitally. But if you think about potential application, this is a TV series that you can find the first season on Amazon Prime Video. If you think about the self-driving car, that would be actually a potential context in which a moral dilemma like that is happening. Because what will the computer of the machine decide when there is a risk of an accident, and there are 2 options? You save the driver, but you need to kill 5 pedestrians. What are you going to do? I mean, this is an issue important for many aspects of everyday life. And if you think about what we are living now, how do you decide who is going to be vaccinated first? Which means that somehow you need to make decision about maybe some segment of the population that need to be sacrificed. This is a moral dilemma, and I really think that the board games are important to play in order to let us discuss and be aware of such important issues. So, folks, I think it's really time to. I don't know if I can start with the end of Super Mario. I mean, a bad game of Super Mario. This is game over. But remember what I was mentioning, that game over is a very reassuring message in saying that once you die, you can reborn and learn from what you did wrong, which I think is the most relevant insight we can get from behavioral sciences. I hope you enjoyed a little bit these condensed videos and you got maybe more questions than answers, but questions that are food for thought. Of course, feel free, now that you have watched the videos, to contact me for any curiosity you have. We can organize office hours, individual, for small groups, and I can't wait to meet you in live classes in order to project together the story of the video game about Office Girls. Ciao ragazzi, it was a pleasure, and let's meet soon.